So we've got our TicTacToe game, and we need to make sure we initialize a new game, and we probably want to have a way to actually start the game whenever we want. So our start method is going to implement the beginning of the game. So we need to add a player, and we need to add actually a second player. One will be an X, one will be an O, and that's going to be how we create our two players. Now we could make this add player method publicly available so someone else could add players for us if we wanted. But we can also have TicTacToe just be aware of how to add players. Now it might be useful for us to have a player class where we can create a player and give them a name, and then we can assign the mark to them. So what we'll do is we'll have an instance variable for the name and the mark. And we'll assign that to the new variables that we passed in, and we'll make them adder, reader, name, and mark, so we can access those from outside. So what we'll do is we will have our add player method down here, and we'll grab a mark, and we'll say if players is empty, if we don't have any players in this array. So by using players here, we're going to use the adder reader to ask for the instance variable and so on. I tend to do this unless I don't have an adder reader. I will try to use the adder reader when I'm just reading from it instead of the instance variable. I'll try and only use the instance variables when I'm setting them, and it just helps keep my code a bit cleaner. So if there are no players, we'll give the first player an X, second player will be assigned an O. And then for grabbing their name, we want to say puts what is your name, and we will grab their name by saying get string from the terminal, and we'll chomp to get rid of any new lines or anything from that. And then we will grab our player class. We will say let's create a new player with this name and this mark, and we will assign them or add them to the players array. So this is the shovel operator that will push a new item onto this array at the end, and so we will add our player like so. So let's try this by saying puts game.player, players rather, and we'll run this in our terminal. So we say Chris and Bob, and here we have two players in our players array. One is named Chris with an X, one is Bob with an O. So this is the way we will keep track of which player we are, which players are in our app or in our game. So we could expose this method publicly, so we wouldn't have to do that at the start. We could have this return or raise a standard error with a message of like 2 players are required to play TicTacToe, and we'll raise that if at players is not equal to 2. And that would be one way we could say, enforce that there are 2 players. And we could say game.add player down here, and so on. So if you wanted to make your games configurable so that other code, like a website, could actually add players to a TicTacToe game that's stored on your server or something, you would want to expose these methods and not actually put it as part of the start or the play game method. This should be for just actually going through the game loop, which is asking users and players to fill in their spots. So I think that's what we're going to do. We'll expose these 2 methods so that we can add our 2 players and start the game. This also opens it up so that we could add other methods to create a player and get their name somewhere, some other way. We could also say if name is nil actually, we could grab this from the user, and so we could actually have Chris and Bob, like so, and that would allow us to create a new game, and I remove the game.players, so we'll put that back. This would allow us to create our 2 players programmatically, so we could grab them from the database or something, and we wouldn't have to prompt for a name unless we were missing them. So that's another option that you can do to kind of improve this as you go along. So let's get into actually building out some of this game logic. So in our start, we're going to raise an error if there aren't the exact correct number of players before we begin. That's definitely a normal thing. And we want to make sure that we go through the process for this correctly. So basically, we want to continue playing this game forever and ever until there is either a win or a draw. So while there is not a win or a draw, we want to keep playing this game. So we can define our method for win and draw here. One of my all-time favorite features of Ruby is that we can actually make these methods end with a question mark so that our code will be even more readable up here. We will know that these methods should return either a truthy or a falsy value. They don't actually have to be true and false, they just have to evaluate to true and false. So for now, let's just have these return false and hard code them to that. We'll come back and fix this later, but that will allow us to build the game loop, and it will run infinitely, of course, but it's going to be a nice option for us to get started. So inside of this loop, we want to print out the board. So we'll have some sort of like render method here, and we can define our render. Let's just do it right here. And we want to print out the game board as some strings. So if we think about this game board, we're going to want to print out board 0 and a pipe, and board 1 and board 2, and then we'll want a divider, and then we'll want another row of the board that will go from 3 to 4 to 5, and then 6 and 7 and 8. And then inside of here we'll want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that for our dividers. Let's print this out and see what it looks like. Okay, so that's printing out a whole lot. And it looks like we may be over by maybe 2 dividers. Let's just remove that. And that will render our tic-tac-toe board for us. We could also do a couple empty lines here if we wanted to separate them so that we have those separated out. And we can begin to do our game loop. Now, one of the things that we need to know is the current player, and actually let's do that here in our start. We'll assign the current player equal to players.first. And then we know which player to ask to fill in their space. So we might want to say get input as the name of a method for gathering some input for the user. This get input will basically print out a current player name. And this is an example of calling a method or an attr reader on another instance. So we have 2 players, they have separate names, and we can ask an instance of a player for their name and their mark when we want to render that out in our render method. And that's going to allow us to say, where would you like to go? 1 through 9. So then we will get their location, and that will be getS. Chomp will convert it to an integer so that we know we have an integer. And then we can set that player's location on the board, and we're going to subtract 1 from that. So they'll type 1, and that will go in the first spot on the board. And so they'll be numbered like humans think of numbering, rather than how computers think of array numbering, where the offset would be 0 instead of 1. So then we can just assign that to the current player, and that should fill out that player here on the board. So let's take a look at what happens then. So we're getting an error for undefined local variable or method current player. We've defined the @current player, but we've tried to reference current player down here without the @ symbol. If we do that with the @ symbol, that will of course fix it, but we can go through and add the current player as an adder reader, which will make this available to the world if they want to ask who's the current player in this tic-tac-toe game. And it also allows us to not have to use the instance variable here. So that will work just as well. So now if we were to type in the number 1, it will show our players inserted into that location, which is pretty cool. This is not what we want to print out though. This is actually the Ruby implementation of the player. So if every player instance is a different one, it will show this memory location in the class name, but that's not super friendly for our users. So what we can do is we can call &.name. This ampersand is the safe method operator. So if this board 0, if that space had a nil in it, which it will always by default, it will try and call name on nil, which doesn't exist, and it will just allow that to not blow up like we see in our error. And if we were to try and do this without that, so it will say undefined method name for nil class. So by doing &.name, we will get it to ignore it or print out the name. And for us, we don't really want the name, we want the mark actually. So let's redo this. We'll say 1, and now we get the X printed out in our space. And for all of the other ones, we get nothing. Now, what we have here is a little bit of shifting going on. You'll notice that we didn't have anything printed out in these board spaces by default. So we want to actually go through and put an OR in here and say that for every one of these that is nil, we actually want an empty space. So let's go in here. And our board will look a lot prettier and more consistent if we print out an empty space instead of that board space. But we might need to change our dividers to match up. And that's looking better. We'll put one more in and we should be good to go. So now we can have player number 1 put in there X, player number 2 put in there X, and so on. We haven't updated all of those to call the &.mark on them, so let's go and do that as well. And that's going to take our player variable and convert that to their mark. So if you aren't familiar with what's going on or not quite wrapping your head around it, we have our players, which are an instance of player. Player 1 is player.new with the name of Chris. They end up with the mark of X. And player 2 is Bob with an O. And basically, we're storing the player inside of the board in each one of those locations. So when you pick the first spot, we put a player here instead of nil. And then when we print it out, if there is a player, we'll print out their mark. And if there is nothing and it's the default nil value, that will be false. And then the OR will trigger and it will print out our empty string of a space. And so that way we always get a space if there is nobody that has taken that spot. And that will allow us to do that. So that allows us to call player1.mark right here. And that safe operator just makes sure that player does exist before we call mark. And if it doesn't, it just skips calling the mark method. So now that we have all that set up, we need to switch our players. So we can render, let's do this. We'll get input, we'll render, and then we'll switch player. So to switch players, we want to simply say @current player equals, and we'll change that to if the current player equals players dot first, then we want players dot last to be the current player. And if it wasn't, we want players dot first to be the current player. Since we have two users, we can just flip them, and that's as simple as we need to go. We don't need to go through the array or anything like that. That will take us to the right player every time. So now if we go through Chris, then Bob, then Chris, then Bob, then Chris, then Bob, and so on. So this is alternating our players. It's also alternating the X's and O's because we're storing those different player variables in each slot. One of the things we haven't done is allowed you to override the existing location. So we need to fix that, and we'll do that in the next episode.